the history of Kenya and the atrocities carried out by the British Army, which has now been accepted as a systematic problem against the Mau Mau rebellion. But you hear about that, as I say, 50 or 60 years later. Vietnam at the time, I mean, I know that wasn't involving British forces, but nevertheless the same sort of laws operate. Vietnam at the time, everyone was on the media saying, all the military leadership was saying on the media, there may have been one or two cases and so on and so forth. Now, I mean, every serious historian recognises, and most people just across the board recognise, that there was a huge level of brutality against the people of Vietnam. That's what happens. What we want is for a change from that pattern. We want the truth to come out now. We want people to understand what these wars, the terrible things that these wars lead to. And the reason for that is the wars are carrying on.
But the case, of course, is that war is never pretty. So a Stop the War coalition would always be against any war and therefore be saying these things, or is this specifically about these wars?
Well, we're against any wars conducted by the British government and the West in pursuit of their own interests and in pursuit of their kind of, as was the case, I believe, in Afghanistan and Iraq. And, it's not good enough to say wars are brutal, therefore brutal things happen, we can't do anything about it. I mean, we want to end the war itself, because I think these things are, in a certain sense, inevitable. But nevertheless, we also want to campaign to try and limit the really terrible damage that's done by these things. I mean, one last point. I mean, the idea that the last 10 years has made the world a safer place when these kind of incidents are happening in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, when the ordinary people of the area are treated in this way. I mean, it's
well, we'll come back to that point in our second half. We'll be discussing not just Iraq, but actually Afghanistan and Libya. Do join us. Welcome back to the Politics and Media Show. In part one, we discussed some of the issues arising out of Britain's involvement in the Iraq War. But now we'll move on to two other conflicts which the UK has been embroiled in over the past decade. The UK has had troops in Afghanistan since the end of 2001, which was sent there in the wake of the 9/11 attacks to go after the leadership of Al-Qaeda. The military has also recently been part of the NATO mission in Libya, which has sought to aid rebels to oust the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. If I can come back to the overall response since 9/11, we were told that it was to make our world a safer place. We had to go into Afghanistan, we had to invade it in order to get Al-Qaeda. Would you say that has actually been achieved? Is the world a safer place, in your opinion?
I think it's very, very hard to say whether it's safer than it would have been had we not done certain things or not safer. It's a very hard question to answer. I don't think any of us can really answer it. What I would say is that going into Afghanistan and removing the Al-Qaeda regime from Afghanistan, removing the Taliban from Afghanistan, was something that had to be done.
So has the Taliban been removed from Afghanistan?
They were removed and they're now back. But Al-Qaeda, of course, we mustn't forget, launched the attack on 9/11, which killed 3,000 people. And since then, Al-Qaeda have carried out attacks around the world that have killed actually more Muslims than they've killed non-Muslims. And the world is safer to an extent, in as much as Al-Qaeda has been thrown out of Afghanistan initially, and has now been put on the back foot in Afghanistan. So it is no longer the kind of potent machine it once was. It still has franchises around the world which are still capable of carrying out attacks. And the West still endeavours, and of course many countries not in the West, endeavour to attack Al-Qaeda and prevent it from carrying out its offences.
Do you think it's been helpful to merge Taliban and Al-Qaeda in that way? Because even the CIA chief in Pakistan at the time of 2001 admitted that Taliban had offered to hand over Osama bin Laden, but America had refused. And Taliban has always said they're a nationalist movement and not like Al-Qaeda, who they themselves have distanced themselves from. And it looks like now, after 2014, whenever the troops do come home, that actually Taliban will have some kind of role to play, whatever government stays there. So has it been smart to put Taliban and Al-Qaeda into one grouping?
I certainly didn't intend to put it into one grouping. If that's the impression I gave, then I was wrong, because it is not one grouping. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda are very separate organisations. They do, however, and have, however, in the past cooperated. The Taliban remains a relatively strong machine. It remains, it's carrying out offensive action which is killing large numbers of Afghan civilians as well as some NATO troops in Afghanistan. It has immense amount of support from Pakistan to enable it to do that. And it can only carry out its operations in Afghanistan because of the support it gets
from Pakistan. Do you think the British government will be negotiating with the Taliban very soon or not?
Well, I think they have tried, and as have the Americans, have tried for many years to negotiate with the Taliban and are still trying to do so. I don't believe that, I mean, there may well be things going on that I'm not privy to. I don't believe that...
well, the Taliban offered a ceasefire going back years now, and that has not been followed through. So
sorry, who offered a ceasefire?
The Taliban, and the condition being that foreign troops leave the country.
Yes, and of course the objective of foreign troops being in Afghanistan is the same as the reason they went in the first place, to deny a safe haven for extremists to operate from, the same type of extremists who launched an attack on the West, killing 3,000 people. And the objective is to prevent that happening again. In my view, if the Taliban were able to reassert themselves and to re-establish a permanent presence in Afghanistan, it wouldn't be very long before Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups came back in. Let's not forget what happened, groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, which started off as a Mujahideen group in Afghanistan, has turned not only into a group that attacks Indians and killed large numbers of people in Mumbai, but also has become an international group. The Pakistan Taliban themselves, separate to a large extent from the Afghan Taliban, have themselves attempted to launch attacks in the United States of America. I think all of these groups, and I include the Taliban in this, that they may say that they're simply a nationalist movement, but I think many of them have aspirations beyond that.
Chris, do you think that logic is accepted, or do you think that has now become very much dated and rejected?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you argue that the war on terror was justified, the response to 9/11 was justified, you have to look at the facts. That means that you're saying that it was justified to kill, at the lower end of the estimations, hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq.
Who killed them? Who killed those people?
Well, those people have been killed as a direct result of the war. So the war that the West generated has killed, at the minimum, hundreds of thousands. And
mainly by Islamist extremists, however.
Well, no, as a result of the violence that has been unleashed by the war. But I mean, the whole point is to move on to. I mean, actually, just to say as well, this means that you think it's justified to have created the situation in Afghanistan where on almost every index of the UN's analysis of the situation, life has gone backwards. It's now the place in the world with the lowest life expectancy. It's the most dangerous place on earth for women to live in. It has no health service to speak of. The education system is shot to pieces. All that is apparently justified. Now, for what? For making the world a safer place, we're told. But actually the reality of the situation is, unsurprisingly, that this level of devastation that has been unleashed by the West has created massive bitterness amongst people in Central Asia and the Middle East. I mean, you know, you don't need to be a genius to understand that, and therefore the level of violence increases. And we see, for example, in Iraq, as you say, as a result of our invasion, the creation of all these jihadist groups, which didn't exist before 2003 and are now still to this day, creating great loss of life. So of course the world has been made a much more dangerous place by what we've done, and it's been a disaster.
And what would be your analysis? Is it a safer or more dangerous place as a result of these interventions?
I would say safer in terms of Al-Qaeda, but not safer, to echo the previous speaker, in terms of the underlying causes, that the forces that led to Al-Qaeda, issues around foreign policy, Israel-Palestine, things such as that, and the anger over Iraq.
So let's say specifically, because we're in the UK, talking about the use of our troops paid for by our taxes. These are young men and women who are asked to risk their lives by politicians who are telling them, and indeed us, that it's for our good.
Right, sure. I mean, I was at the first Reith lecture by the former head of MI5, where she specifically linked the invasion of Iraq to terrorism against the UK. That the anger over that led some young British Muslims, the 7/7 bombers, to carry out horrendous attacks on the tube system in London, and that's part of the blowback from the last 10 years. That it's, in a sense, less about 9/11 than the response of the West to 9/11.